All right, so we're diving into conveyancing today. You know, the legal stuff when you buy a house.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a maze for sure.
It seems pretty intense, actually.
Most people don't realize how much is involved until they're actually doing it.
Right.
Luckily, we've got this great guide, Conveyancing Process Explained for Buyers.
Conveyancing process explained for buyers
Okay.
from the Homeowners Alliance.
Homeowners Alliance, perfect. So they break it down into 11 stages. That's a lot of stages. And one of the things that really struck me was that it can take 12 to 16 weeks on average. Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, that's longer than some people spend planning a wedding. It's a big commitment. And that timeline is something to really keep in mind, especially if you're part of a chain.
A chain.
Yeah, where delays from one buyer or seller can really impact everyone else in the process. It has a ripple effect.
Oh, wow. Okay, I hadn't thought about that. And also, you need buildings insurance before you even sign the contracts.
Yeah, that's one of the things that surprises people. Seems a little counterintuitive.
It is, but it makes sense when you think about it.
Okay.
Because from the moment the contracts are exchanged, you're legally responsible for the property.
Oh, okay.
So having insurance in place beforehand protects you from anything unexpected happening.
Right, right. So, like, let's say a storm damages the roof or something.
Exactly, yeah. So it's kind of like the insurance company's way of saying, okay, you're taking ownership, so you're also taking on the risk.
Right. So, where do things kick off? What's the very first step in this whole process?
The first stage is to instruct a conveyancing solicitor.
Okay. So that's the legal expert who's going to be handling all the paperwork and guiding you through the process.
Exactly.
So I'm assuming it's not as simple as just picking a random solicitor out of a phone book.
No, no, not at all.
So what does the guide recommend?
It's really important to shop around and get quotes from different solicitors
Quotes. Okay.
because the guide says the average saving from comparing quotes is actually £490.
490 pounds. Wow, that's real money.
It is, yeah. It may not be the most exciting part of the process, but it's definitely worth the effort.
Definitely. So once you've found your solicitor and they've done all their initial checks, like ID verification and anti-money laundering and all that stuff, what's next? What's stage 2?
So stage 2 is the draft contract and inquiries.
Okay, so this is where things start to get serious.
Exactly. So the seller's solicitor will prepare a draft contract
Okay.
outlining all the terms of the sale, and then your solicitor will review it very carefully, and they'll raise any questions or concerns that they have.
Okay, so it's like a back and forth between the two solicitors, making sure everything is crystal clear.
Exactly, yeah. And this is where those forms, the TA6 and the TA10, come into play.
Oh yeah, the forms. The guide mentioned those.
They provide detailed information about the property, everything from boundaries and fixtures to any known issues or restrictions.
Okay, so why so many forms? It just seems a little bit overwhelming.
Well, it's a huge financial and emotional investment. So buying a house is a really big deal. And these forms are all about making sure that both the buyer and the seller have all the information they need.
Right, transparency.
Exactly.
Okay, so the TA6, that's the one that gives you the rundown on what's included in the sale,
Yep.
right? And any guarantees, and if there have been any disputes about the property.
That's right. Yeah, it's
Yes.
kind of like getting the property's background check.
A rap sheet for the property.
Right.
Okay, so you're not going in completely blind.
Exactly. And then the TA10, that one goes into more detail about things that could really impact your ownership. And this is where the whole leasehold versus freehold distinction becomes really important.
Yeah, the guide mentioned that, the leasehold versus freehold.
It's really important to understand the difference.
Can you just remind me why? What's the big deal?
Sure. So freehold means you own the building and the land it's on outright.
Okay, so you own it. That's simple enough.
Leasehold means you're essentially renting the property for a fixed term. And the length of the lease is really crucial because if it gets below 80 years, it can cause problems.
Problems. Like what kind of problems?
Well, it could affect the property's value,
Mm-hmm.
and it could be really expensive to extend the lease.
Oh, okay.
And once it dips below 60 years, it's a real red flag.
So it's not just about how many years are left. It's about the cost and the hassle of having to extend it down the line.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on that lease length. So what comes after the draft contract and all those inquiries?
Stage 3 is the property survey.
The survey, right. Now, the guide mentioned that this isn't actually legally required,
No, it's not mandatory, but it is highly recommended,
even if it's a new property.
even if it's a new property.
Okay, so why bother getting a survey if you don't have to?
It's really about peace of mind
Okay.
because a survey can uncover problems that you might not see during a viewing. like damp or structural issues, even potential hazards.
Mm.
It's a small investment that could potentially save you a lot of money in the long run.
So it's like insurance against any nasty surprises?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So what kind of surveys are we talking about?
There are different levels of surveys depending on how much detail you want.
Okay.
A basic survey will give you a general overview of the condition of the property. A more comprehensive survey will go into more detail about specific areas like the
Yeah.
roof, the electrics, the plumbing.
Okay, so the more detail you want, the more comprehensive the survey you need.
Exactly. And depending on the age and type of property, there might be specific surveys recommended, like a dam survey or a timber and dam survey.
Okay, so the type of survey you choose really depends on the property and your level of concern, I guess.
Yeah.
So once the survey is done, what happens next?
That's when we move on to stage 4, which is conducting property searches.
Property searches. Okay, this is like the deep dive into the property's past.
Exactly.
So what are we searching for here?
Essentially, you're looking for any hidden issues or liabilities that could affect your enjoyment of the property or even its value.
Okay, so give me an example. What kind of things might come up in these searches?
Well, you've got local authority searches,
Okay.
which can reveal things like planned developments in the area, like new roads or construction projects that might affect your quality of life.
Right, because nobody wants a big construction site popping up next door after they've just moved in.
Exactly.
What other searches are there?
There are land registry searches. They confirm that the seller actually owns the property and that there are no disputes over the ownership.
Okay.
There are flood risk searches, water authority searches,
Okay.
and then there's one that might surprise you.
Oh, what's that?
It's a search for chancel repair liability.
Chancel repair liability. What is that? That sounds like something out of medieval times.
It is.
Okay, so tell me more.
In certain parts of the country, if your property falls within the boundaries of a medieval parish, you could be liable for contributing to the repair costs of the local church.
Wait a minute. So my dream home could come with a medieval church tax attached to it.
It's not that common, but it is a real possibility, and that's why this specific search is so important.
Wow, that's wild. So these searches really are like a deep dive into the property's past, present, and even future.
They are. They're crucial for making an informed decision and avoiding nasty surprises down the line.
Okay. So once we've navigated the world of property searches, what's next?
Stage 5 is conveyancing for your mortgage.
Right, because unless you're a cash buyer, you're going to need financing to buy the house.
Exactly. So you'll have a mortgage valuation
Okay.
where the lender assesses the property's worth to see how much they're willing to lend you.
Yeah.
And your solicitor will review the valuation report and the conditions of your mortgage offer to make sure everything is in order.
So it's not just about finding the right house, it's about finding the right financing as well and making sure all the pieces fit together.
Absolutely. And this is where having a good solicitor can really make a difference.
Can we circle back to that buildings insurance we talked about earlier?
Sure.
I'm still a little fuzzy on why you need it so early in the process.
Yeah, so that's stage 6. And it's important because
You become legally responsible the moment the contracts are exchanged, right?
Yeah.
So the insurance company needs to know you're in charge before things become official.
Yeah, you got it. It's a really important step to protect yourself. And it's a good reminder that exchanging contracts is a major milestone.
It sounds like a point of no return.
It is, in many ways. Which brings us to stage 7, which is signing the contracts.
Okay. Deep breaths, everybody. This is where things start to feel real.
Before you actually sign anything, your solicitor will do a final check to make sure everything is in order. So they'll verify that all your inquiries have been answered, that the fixtures and fittings are as agreed, and that the contract accurately reflects all the terms that have been negotiated.
Okay, that's good to know. But the guide mentioned something about a potential risk if you back out after exchanging contracts.
Yeah, that's right. If you decide to pull out after you've exchanged contracts, you forfeit your deposit.
Oh, wow. So it's not just a matter of changing your mind. There are real consequences.
Exactly. Exchanging contracts is not something to be taken lightly.
So what does the guide recommend doing before you sign?
It's always a good idea to do a final walkthrough of the property with the estate agent, just to make sure everything is as you remember it.
Okay, yeah. Double checking never hurts, especially with something as big as this.
Right. Are you ready for the moment of truth?
I think so. Bring on stage 8.
Stage 8 is exchanging contracts.
Exchanging contracts. Okay.
This is where the deal becomes legally binding for both the buyer and the seller. And it's usually handled by the solicitors. They read the contracts aloud over a recorded phone call.
Wait, they read the whole thing out loud?
Yep.
That seems a bit old school in this digital age.
It is, but it's a long-standing tradition.
Okay.
It helps to avoid misunderstandings and make sure that both parties have identical copies.
Okay, I guess tradition has its place, especially when it comes to something as important as this.
Exactly.
So what happens after the contracts are exchanged? Is that it? Do we pop the champagne?
Not quite yet. There's still a little bit of a wait before you get the keys. Stage 9 is that in-between period after exchange, but before completion.
So what happens during that time? Are we just sitting around twiddling our thumbs?
Well, your solicitor will be busy behind the scenes, lodging an interest in the property with the land registry.
Okay.
This essentially freezes the deeds for a short period
Okay.
to prevent any other transactions from taking place and allows for the smooth transfer of ownership to you.
So it's like putting a temporary hold on the property while everything gets finalized.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, you'll probably be busy finalizing your moving plans,
Right.
booking removal companies, making sure utilities are set up.
Oh, yeah. Lots of logistics to think about.
Yeah. And the guide stresses the importance of having that final payment ready at least one day before completion.
Okay.
Once the seller's solicitor confirms receipt of all the funds, you're officially a homeowner.
That must be an amazing feeling. So stage 10 is completion day, the day you finally get the keys and can start picturing yourself in your new home.
Exactly. It's a culmination of all those weeks of work. It's a big day.
But wait, there's still one more stage, right?
You got it.
Stage 11. What happens in this final stage?
This is where your solicitor ties up the loose ends.
Okay. Okay.
They'll pay the stamp duty land tax.
Ah, yes, stamp duty, that lovely tax.
They'll register the property in your name at the land registry.
Okay.
So you're officially the legal owner. And if it's a leasehold property, they'll notify the freeholder.
Great. Gotta let the landlord know.
Exactly. And then once that's all done, the conveyancing process is officially over.
Wow. So your solicitor sends you the final bill, you gather all your paperwork and keep it safe, and that's it. You're done.
That's it. You're done.
That's amazing. It's quite a journey. Now, speaking of journeys, the Homeowners Alliance, they also have a separate guide for the conveyancing process, but from the seller's perspective.
They do, yeah.
So is it basically the same process, just in reverse?
There are some similarities, but there are also some key differences. For example, sellers don't need to worry about property searches, but they do need to provide detailed information about the property to the potential buyers.
Right, yeah. So transparency is important on both sides of the transaction.
Absolutely.
And as we've seen, transparency is really at the heart of the whole conveyancing process.
Yeah, it helps protect both the buyer and the seller.
And make sure everything runs smoothly. Well, this deep dive into conveyancing has been incredibly enlightening.
It's a complex process, but hopefully breaking it down into these stages makes it a little easier to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Homeowners Alliance Guide is so helpful, full of practical advice and tips. It's a must-read for anyone who's involved in the property market.
I agree.
Okay, so we've covered the first 10 stages of conveyancing, from finding a solicitor to finally getting those keys. But you mentioned the guide has 11 stages, so what's that last one all about?
Yeah, stage 11 is all about wrapping things up on the legal side.
Okay, tell me more. What happens in this final stage?
Well, your solicitor handles a few more crucial tasks.
Okay.
So first up, they pay the stamp duty land tax on your behalf.
Ah, yes, stamp duty. Can't forget about that.
It's a big expense for many home buyers, but your solicitor takes care of calculating the amount and paying it to HMRC. Then they officially register the property in your name with the land registry,
Okay.
which essentially means you're officially recognized as the new owner.
So it's like updating the property's profile to say, hey, new owner here.
Exactly. And then if it's a leasehold property, your solicitor will also notify the freeholder.
Right. Gotta let the landlord know there's a new tenant in town.
Exactly. And once all that's done, the conveyancing process is officially complete.
So is that it? Does the solicitor send their final bill? You gather all the paperwork, keep it safe, and you're done.
That's it. You're a homeowner.
Wow. It's incredible how much goes on behind the scenes of buying a property. It really is a journey.
Is.
But hopefully, by breaking it down into these stages, it makes it a little less daunting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the Homeowners Alliance, they've done a great job with this guide. Lots of practical advice and tips.
Definitely.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's just recap the key takeaways. What are the most important things our listener needs to remember from this first part of the journey?
Okay, well, first and foremost, remember that conveyancing is the legal process of transferring ownership of a property. It's really important to understand the different stages involved And it's a process that takes time. It can take several months. So you need to be prepared to be patient.
Yeah, patience is key, especially if there's a chain of buyers and sellers involved.
Absolutely. Another important takeaway is to shop around for a conveyancing solicitor. Don't just go with the first one you find or the one recommended by the estate agent. Comparing quotes can save you a lot of money.
Yeah, hundreds of pounds potentially.
Exactly.
It's also important to ask questions. Your solicitor is there to guide you through the process, so don't be afraid to ask if something is unclear.
Absolutely.
And what about that property survey we talked about? Even though it's not legally required, it's still highly recommended, right?
It is. Think of it as peace of mind insurance. Better to know up front if there are any issues with the property than to have to deal with them after you've bought it.
Absolutely. And those property searches are really important as well. They're like a background check for the house.
Yes,
They can reveal hidden issues that might not be obvious during a viewing.
like that medieval church tax we talked about.
Exactly. It's amazing what can turn up in those searches.
Yeah.
So the moral of the story is do your homework, ask questions, and be prepared for the long haul.
Well said.
But the reward is worth it. Owning your own home is a huge achievement, and understanding the conveyancing process can help make the journey a little less stressful. Now that we've laid the groundwork, it's time to dive into some of the more, I guess you could say, intriguing aspects of conveyancing.
I'm intrigued.
Okay, buckle up, everyone. Things are about to get interesting. Okay, so that medieval church tax, the chancel repair liability,
Uh-huh.
it sounds like something straight out of Monty Python. Can we dig into that a little bit more? What's the story there?
Okay, well, so it really is a fascinating piece of history. It all goes back to, medieval England when parishes were responsible for maintaining their local churches. And landowners within those parish boundaries were obligated to contribute financially to those repairs. So it was like a historical HOA fee, but for a church.
A church HOA fee, right?
Exactly. And, this system has largely fallen into disuse, but in some areas, this chance repair liability still exists.
Okay, but if it's so old, why is it still relevant today? I don't get it.
Because legally, the liability is attached to the land. It's not attached to the individual owner. So even though it seems like a very old practice, it can still have real financial implications for homeowners today.
Okay, so it's not just a historical curiosity, it's a potential financial burden.
Exactly.
So how does this even come up during the conveyancing process? When do you find out about this?
That's where those property searches we talked about come in. One of the searches specifically looks for this liability.
Okay.
And if your property is in an affected area, it gets flagged as a potential issue.
So what happens if the search reveals this liability? Does that mean the deal is off?
Not necessarily. It just means that you need to be aware of it
Okay.
and factor it into your decision. So you can, you could try to negotiate with the seller to have them take out indemnity insurance,
Okay.
which would basically protect you from any future claims.
So it's like transferring the risk to the insurance company.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or you might decide that the liability is too great and you walk away from the deal. It really depends on your own circumstance.
Right, your risk tolerance.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not a deal breaker, but it's something to take seriously and discuss with your solicitor. This whole chancel repair thing, it really highlights how important those property searches are.
Absolutely. You never know what might turn up.
Speaking of things that can turn up, another thing I wanted to ask you about was the whole leasehold versus freehold issue.
Yeah,
Can we dig into that a little bit deeper?
sure. As we said earlier, the length of the lease is really important when you're buying a leasehold property.
Right. And the guide mentioned something about leases under 80 years becoming problematic. Can you elaborate on that? Why is that such a big deal?
Well, basically, as a lease gets shorter, it becomes less attractive to buyers, which can impact the value of the property.
So it's like a ticking time bomb. As the lease runs out, the value goes down.
Kinda, yeah. And the closer you get to the end of the lease, the more expensive it becomes to extend it. So once it drops below 80 years, the cost goes up significantly.
Okay, why is that?
Well, the freeholder, who owns the land the property is built on, has a vested interest in keeping those leases short because it gives them more control over the property. And they can charge higher premiums for lease extensions.
So it's in their best interest to let those leases tick down. That doesn't seem very fair to the leaseholder.
It can be frustrating, yeah, especially since the cost of extending a lease can be really high. It can be tens of thousands of pounds.
Wow, that's a lot of money. So what happens if you can't afford to extend the lease? Do you just lose the property?
Technically, the property reverts back to the freeholder when the lease expires. but there are laws in place to protect leaseholders and give them the right to extend.
Okay, so it's not a complete loss, but still a very complicated situation.
Oh.
So what should our listener be looking out for when it comes to leasehold properties? What are the red flags?
Well, the most important thing is to look at the length of the lease.
Okay.
Anything under 80 years should be a cause for concern.
Okay, so short leases, bad news. What else?
You should also look into the ground rent and service charges
Okay.
because those can add up over time, and sometimes they increase significantly.
So it's not just about the purchase price, it's about the ongoing costs as well.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand the financial implications before you commit.
Yeah. And this is where having a good solicitor is so important. They
Absolutely.
can help you understand all this stuff.
They can review the lease terms, they
Yeah.
can advise you on your rights, and they can even negotiate with the freeholder.
Okay, so we've talked about chancellor repair liability. We've talked about the ins and outs of leasehold properties. Are there any other sort of hidden dangers that our listeners should be aware of?
Um, well, one thing that people often overlook is the importance of boundaries.
Boundaries, you mean like fences and hedges?
Not just the physical boundaries, but the legal boundaries.
Okay.
These define the extent of your ownership, and sometimes they can be different from what you see on the ground.
So it's not as simple as just looking at where the fence is.
Right. Disputes over boundaries are surprisingly common, and they can be very costly to resolve.
So how do you avoid these potential boundary battles?
Well, that's where your solicitor comes in again. They'll review the title deeds, they'll look at any plans or maps associated with the property, and they might even conduct a physical inspection to confirm the boundaries.
So they're like boundary detectives.
Exactly. And if there are any discrepancies or uncertainties, they'll work with the seller's solicitor to clarify the boundaries before contracts are exchanged.
Wow. It's amazing how much detail goes into all of this. It really shows how important it is to have a solicitor you can trust.
Absolutely. They're your advocate, your guide through this whole process.
Speaking of the process, we've talked a lot about the legal and financial side of conveyancing, but I'm also curious about the emotional side of things. I mean, buying a house is a huge life event. It must be a roller coaster of emotions.
It is, yeah. It's not just a transaction, it's a really personal journey.
Right. So what kind of emotional ride should our listeners be prepared for?
Well, there's the initial excitement, of course, when you find a property you love,
Right.
the anticipation of making an offer,
Yeah.
the thrill of having your offer accepted. But then comes the waiting game while the conveyancing process unfolds, and that can be quite nerve-wracking.
Yeah, especially with those potential delays we talked about. It must feel like you're in limbo, just waiting for things to move forward.
Exactly. And then there are, inevitably there are bumps in the road, unexpected search results, boundary issues, sometimes even disagreements with the seller.
So it's not all, sunshine and roses.
No, not always. There will be moments of frustration, doubt, maybe even a few tears along the way.
So what advice would you give our listeners for navigating the emotional side of things?
Well, first of all, I would say communication is key.
Okay.
Talk to your solicitor, talk to your estate agent, talk to your partner, your family, your friends, anyone you trust.
Hmm.
Don't bottle up your feelings.
A problem shared is a problem halved.
Exactly. And try to focus on the bigger picture. Remember why you're doing this, what your goals are, and the excitement of eventually owning your own home.
Yeah, it's easy to get bogged down in the details and forget about the end goal.
Absolutely. And if you start to feel overwhelmed, just take a step back, breathe, and remind yourself that this is just a process. It will come to an end eventually.
Right, and hopefully a happy ending. So we've explored the legal side of conveyancing, the financial side, the emotional side. Is there anything else our listeners should be aware of before embarking on this adventure?
One more thing I think it's worth mentioning is the role of technology in conveyancing these days.
Oh, yeah.
Traditionally it's been a very paper-heavy process, but with, the advances in technology, things are starting to change.
That's interesting. So what kind of technology are we talking about?
Well, now there are online platforms where you can track the progress of your case, upload and sign documents digitally, communicate with your solicitor securely.
So it's like having a virtual conveyancing dashboard.
Yeah, exactly. And some platforms even use artificial intelligence to automate certain tasks, which can speed things up.
Wow. What are the benefits of using these online platforms?
Well, for starters, it offers greater transparency.
Okay.
You can see exactly where you are in the process, what's been done, what still needs to be done. And because a lot of the communication is handled digitally, it's much faster and more efficient.
Right, so it's more convenient.
Exactly.
Are there any downsides to using these online platforms?
Well, some people might prefer the personal touch of dealing with their solicitor face-to-face. And it's always important to make sure you're using a reputable platform that has good security measures in place.
Okay, so it's about finding the right balance between technology and human interaction.
Yeah. And it's definitely worth discussing with your solicitor whether they offer online services and if those services are a good fit for you.
It's fascinating to see how technology is changing the conveyancing process.
Yeah, it is.
It's exciting to think about what the future holds.
Definitely. But even with all the advancements in technology, it's important to remember that buying a house is still a really big legal and financial undertaking.
Right, it's not something to be taken lightly.
Exactly. And that's why having a good solicitor on your side is so important, even if you're using these new technologies.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've talked about some of the more nuanced aspects of conveyancing. Before we move on to the final part, where we'll be exploring some practical tips and resources, let's just recap. What are the most important things our listeners should remember?
Okay.
What are the key takeaways?
Well, I think the overall theme here is due diligence.
Okay, due diligence.
It's not enough to just find a property you love and make an offer. You need to do your research, you need to ask questions, and you need to understand the potential risks.
Right, so be an informed buyer. What specific areas should our listener be focusing on?
Well, first of all, those property searches are really important. They can uncover hidden issues like that chancel repair liability we talked about that you might not see during a viewing.
Right, because no one's going to say, oh, by the way, this house might come with a medieval church tax.
Exactly. So property searches, check. And then the lease terms, if it's a leasehold property, the length of the lease, the ground rent, the service charges, they can all have a big impact.
Yeah, that dream home could turn into a financial nightmare.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the property boundaries.
Yeah.
Make sure you understand what the boundaries are.
Right, avoid those boundary battles.
Exactly.
And what about the role of technology in all of this?
Technology can be a great tool.
Hmm.
Those online platforms can offer greater transparency and efficiency.
So embrace the power of technology.
Yeah, but also recognize that human expertise is still important.
Right. Find the balance.
Exactly.
Okay, well, after this discussion, I'm feeling a lot more informed about the potential pitfalls of conveyancing, but I'm also feeling a bit more hopeful. With the right knowledge and the right team, this process can be navigated successfully.
It definitely can.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork, we've explored the intricacies, and now it's time to get practical. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll be sharing some valuable tips and resources to help our listener tackle conveyancing with confidence.
Sounds good.
Let's do it. Okay, so we've explored all the ins and outs of conveyancing, but now let's talk about how you can actually put all this knowledge into practice. Any practical tips for our listener to navigate this process smoothly?
Absolutely. One of the most important things is to assemble a really good team.
A team. Okay.
So that means finding a solicitor that you trust, an estate agent who understands your needs,
Okay.
and maybe even a mortgage broker to help you find the best financing options.
So it's like building your A-team for this whole property buying adventure.
Exactly.
Okay, I like it.
And don't be afraid to ask for recommendations from friends, family, colleagues, anyone who's recently gone through this process.
Right, word of mouth can be really valuable.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about resources? Are there any websites, books, organizations that our listeners should check out for additional guidance?
Well, the Homeowners Alliance, the guide that we've been using, they have a fantastic website with tons of information on all aspects of buying a home, including conveyancing.
Right, and they have guides for sellers, too.
It's exactly.
We mentioned that earlier.
The government website, gov.uk, also has a section on buying and selling property. So there you can find helpful guides and links to legislation.
Perfect. So those are some good starting points.
Definitely.
What about staying organized? Because I imagine with conveyancing, there's a lot of paperwork involved.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of paperwork. So it's really important to have a system for keeping track of everything. Create folders, use online document storage, whatever works for you.
Find a method to the madness.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask your solicitor for copies of all the documents.
Great.
You have a right to see everything.
So stay organized, ask questions, get copies of everything.
Exactly.
What else? Any other tips?
I think one thing that people often forget is to try and build a good relationship with their solicitor.
Okay.
Conveyancing can be stressful, so it really helps to have a solicitor who you feel comfortable talking to, someone who understands your concerns.
So it's not just about legal expertise, it's also about finding someone you can connect with.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to shop around until you find a solicitor who you feel is the right fit for you.
So find your conveyancing soulmate.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, so assemble your team, use the resources that are out there, stay organized, and build a good relationship with your solicitor. Great advice. Any final words of encouragement for our listener as they embark on their conveyancing journey?
I would say go into it with a positive attitude. Be open to learning. It might seem daunting, but it's a process that millions of people have gone through.
You're not alone.
Exactly. And remember that the end goal is really worth it. Owning your own home is a dream for so many people, and getting through the conveyancing process successfully is a key step to achieving that dream.
That's a great way to put it.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a fascinating deep dive into conveyancing. We've explored the history, the legalities, the potential pitfalls. We've talked about strategies for success. To our listener, we hope you feel empowered and informed. Remember, knowledge is power. With the right information and the right team, you can navigate this process and make your dream of homeownership a reality. Thanks for joining us.
Good luck.